Well, welcome, my friends, to our new adventure in a new book, 2 Samuel. Now, 2 Samuel picks up where 1 Samuel leaves off. And 1 Samuel, remember, told us the story of the prophet Samuel and King Saul, and also importantly, about the transition from the period of the judges to the period of the kings. Now, let's take just a brief snapshot of Israel's history. Following the time of the patriarchs, that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jacob's 12 sons go into Egypt, where they attained great numbers, and eventually they became enslaved. Now, the period of Israel in Egypt was about 400 years. And following the Exodus came the period of the judges in the Promised Land, which also lasted about 400 years, ending with the last judge, Samuel. And the period of the kings begins with Saul and lasts about 500 years, until Israel is conquered by the Babylonians and the people carried off into exile for 70 years. So the nation of Israel had three periods before the exile: 400 years in Egypt, 400 years under the judges, and then 500 years under the kings. So that's an easy way to remember it all. Now, we're in 2 Samuel, and it tells the story of the rise of David to become king over all Israel. This first chapter deals with the aftermath of Saul's death in the battle with the Philistines, which was recorded at the end of 1 Samuel. Now, Saul's death brought a period of disruption, intrigue, and treachery as various individuals and factions fought for position and power. So let's begin with the first verse. Now it came about after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David remained 2 days in Ziklag. Now, Ziklag was a village in the desert between Israel and the Philistines. Its remote location was an ideal hiding place from Saul for David and his men. And David had just returned, we read, from fighting the Amalekites. And we read about that story in 1 Samuel 30. And you'll remember that while David and his men were away, the Amalekite raiders had attacked Ziklag. They burned it with fire and carried away the wives and children of David and his men to become slaves. It was the lowest point in David's life. In fact, his own men spoke of stoning him. However, David strengthened himself in God and took his men and pursued the Amalekites. They destroyed them and rescued all their wives and children and regained all their property. Now it's just 3 days after this great test of David, and a stranger arrives to bring word that Saul, David's great persecutor, is dead, having fallen in battle along with his son Jonathan. And David asked this man how he knows this to be true. Let's read verse 6 through 10. The young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear. And behold, the charioteers and the horsemen pursued him closely. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and he called me, and he said, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered, 'I am an Amalekite.'" Note that. Then he said to me, "Please stand beside me and kill me, for agony has seized me, because my life still lingers in me." So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. Now the man is lying. In 1 Samuel 31, we read that Saul killed himself with his own sword, and then his armor bearer, after confirming that Saul was dead, also committed suicide with his own sword. In truth, this man was probably just a looter who was looting the dead on the battlefield when he came across Saul's body and stole the crown and bracelets. Now, he probably thought he would get an even greater reward from David if he claimed he had killed Saul himself. Well, he obviously didn't know David. Notice that this man was an Amalekite, just like those who had taken David's wife and children. The Amalekites were Israel's greatest enemies. In fact, the Amalekites were the first nation to attack the Israelites after they had left Egypt. Now, the Amalekite kingdom was not a part of the Promised Land, so the Israelites posed no threat to them. Nevertheless, the Amalekites launched a vicious and unprovoked attack against Israel. They attacked from the rear, slaughtering the women and children as Israel was marching towards Canaan. And you can read about that in Exodus 17. God considered this attack so egregious, so shocking and horrifying, and that the Amalekites were so wicked that God determined that Israel should never make a treaty with them, but rather should remain in perpetual enmity with them. Now, unfortunately for this man, David took him at his word that he had killed Saul. And rather than receiving a reward, David had him killed on the spot. Verses 14 and 15. Then David said to him, "How is it that you were not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" And David called on one of the young men and said, "Go cut him down." So he struck him and he died. Now, being a wicked Amalekite, this man did not understand the ways of God's covenant people. Note how different was the response of David and his men to the death of King Saul. Upon hearing of Saul's death, they tore their robes and they mourned. David refused to rejoice in the fact that Israel's king, chosen by God himself, had been killed by Israel's enemies, the Philistines. He refused to place his own self-interest above that of the nation. And beginning in verse 17, David chants a lament he composed concerning Saul and Jonathan's death. In verse 23, he says that David and Jonathan were swifter than eagles and stronger than lions. In verse 24, he tells the daughters of Israel to weep over them because Saul had brought such benefit to his people. Now, while Saul was a very imperfect man, he was, at the same time, God's chosen instrument who gave Israel a measure of victory and rest against her enemies. Israel had grown stronger and safer under Saul. David honored Saul as God's instrument that had brought victories to Israel. Israel would become a great nation under David, but that work had begun under Saul. Now, let's just consider some lessons we can learn from David. First, we must honor God's chosen instruments in spite of their personal flaws and shortcomings. David assessed Saul on the basis of his brave and beneficial deeds done on behalf of God's people, rather than on the basis of his unfair actions against David. Secondly, David refused to try and bring about God's promise to him that he would be king through unrighteous means. He refused to take ungodly shortcuts, but instead he left the matter to God's timing and action. When Saul fell into David's hands at the cave of En-Gedi, as recorded in 1 Samuel 23, David refused to kill Saul despite the pressure he received from his men. Instead, he merely said to Saul, "May the Lord judge between you and me, but my hand shall not be against you." He refused to take matters into his own hands and strike down the Lord's anointed. He left it to the Lord to fulfill the promise in the Lord's own way and timing. And finally, we learn that God's greatest breakthroughs for us often follow our greatest tests. It was just 3 days after David's greatest test that the doorway for David to become king opens with the death of Saul. Passing difficult tests opens the door to God's greatest breakthroughs for us. Hey, God bless you, and may your heart be open today to receive from the goodness of God. We'll see you again soon.